All right, so the question you should be asking yourself right now is, why does that guy have a campground pedestal in his kitchen? Welcome back to Fairwinds RV, everyone. My name is still Jeremy, and this is the third video in a series that we're putting out discussing RV electrical systems. If you remember from my first two videos, the first one we covered really just the basics of what the RV electrical systems look like, the three different systems, the 120 volt AC system, the coach battery system, and then the DC automotive system. The second video we covered how do you actually hook up to a campground pedestal? What are some of the things that you need to check before you plug in to make sure that you're going to plug into a safe pedestal that's not going to cause your RV any damage and that is potentially, hopefully not going to hurt you in the process. So this video, what we're going to focus on is a little bit of troubleshooting that you can do pretty easily with some very basic tools in that event, because it will happen to all of you in that event that you pull into your favorite campground, you get everything set up, get shore power connected, you close the breaker, and then there's no power. So combined with the very simple checks that you can do before you actually turn the power on that we covered in the previous video, there are some very simple troubleshooting steps that you can take when you do encounter problems with your electrical distribution system in your RV. All right, so obviously I've got this campground pedestal here in my RV, so it's not hooked up to anything. This is just a prop that I'm using to kind of show you guys maybe a couple of things that you might run into when you come across a pedestal that's not in the greatest shape. So some of the things that we're going to cover along the way here is we're going to cover just some basic problems or issues that you might run into. We're going to cover some symptoms, right, that you might come across that are associated with these problems. And then we're going to talk about some very basic steps that you can take to resolve these issues or at least prove whether the problem is with your RV or whether it's with the campground. And then the last thing I'm going to cover is something that I should have covered last week, and that's going to be some RV shore power adapter cables. You're going to run into several campgrounds, probably if you do this a lot, where you're not going to have the connection that you need. So let's say you're a 50 amp rig, but the site that you're in, all they had available was a 30 amp site. So they make adapters for those specific situations. So if you have a 50 amp rig, you can still plug into a 30 amp outlet. So we're going to take a look at that at the end because honestly, that's just something I forgot to point out in the last video. So we'll just cover it as a bonus at the end of this one. All right, so let's start covering some of the problems that you're likely going to see out there or could see out there with campground pedestals. And the first one that we're going to talk about here is really the most likely one that you're going to come across, and that is just a breaker that won't stay shut. All right, and there are a few reasons that can happen, but we're just going to focus on really what the most common ones are. So the first one I would say the most common is really just going to be a faulty breaker on the pedestal itself, meaning that breaker, when you pull in and you plug up and everything, that breaker just won't stay shut initially, or maybe it'll shut initially, but then it keeps tripping on you. Either way, the first thing that I would assume after doing this for a little while and doing this work camping gig for a little while is that is a faulty breaker, and you probably should just get someone from the campground involved in that immediately. The second common issue that you're probably going to run across at some point when that breaker won't stay shut is probably just a case of overloading it. So let's say it's the middle of the summertime, you got a big rig, you got all your air conditioners running, you're trying to run the microwave, maybe you got the electric water heater on to save some propane. All of that load, right, starts to add up. And eventually you could trip the breaker in the pedestal. And it's just simply because you're running too much stuff at once. So the easiest way to troubleshoot that one is, hey, maybe just turn off one of those air conditioners for a little while and see if that breaker will stay tripped. All right, another thing that might cause one of these breakers to trip is an actual ground fault condition. Now, a ground fault condition can happen when there's some sort of fault in your RV where the electricity is touching something that it's not supposed to. And the ground fault breaker, or it could be a ground fault outlet, it's going to sense that condition and it's going to immediately trip that breaker or that outlet to prevent you from getting shocked. So when we're looking at the campground pedestal, the only thing that's on here that's probably going to have a ground fault trip on it is either maybe the 20 amp outlet or the 20 amp breaker. So typically the 30 amp and the 50 amp breakers will not have ground fault trips on them. It's usually just the 20 amp breaker or the outlet. Right, so those are the three most common causes of a breaker that won't stay shut. So it's either a faulty breaker, or you're overloading that circuit, or it may have encountered a ground fault trip. All right, so now let's talk about one of the more common issues that I've seen as well, which could be a low voltage condition at the pedestal. So when you're doing those checks when you pull in, those initial checks that we covered in the last video, where you're checking line 1 to neutral, line 2 to neutral if you have a 50 amp rig, then what you should see, if you remember, is about 120 to 125 volts between the line and the neutral. Now, if you see something much less than that, maybe 118 volts or so is okay, but once you get down into, say 114 or 112 volts, that's really not a good condition. And if you see that, personally, I wouldn't hook up to a pedestal that was down to, say, that 112 or 114 volts. Now, there are a couple of things that could cause that. It could be an issue somewhere on the campground, maybe with the transformer. It could be a utility issue coming straight from the utility. But more than likely, what it probably is going to be like in the middle of the summertime, again, where everybody's running their air conditioners, and there's just a huge load on that distribution system at the campground in general. And when that happens, when you put a huge load on there like that, that voltage is going to tend to drop. Now, in that situation, you really can't do anything about it. But just keep in mind, once you get down, low in that low voltage range of about 114, maybe 116 volts, you might need to think about whether or not you want to really hook up to that pedestal. All right, so the third condition I want to talk about here, and I've seen it a few times here at this campground, is what we call an unbalanced voltage condition. So remember, going back to taking those checks, say when you're checking that 50 amp connection here, and you go from line 1 to ground and you go line 2 to ground, each one of those should get about 120 volts or so. Now, what you shouldn't see, and it's not a good situation to be in, and I definitely recommend you do not connect to the pedestal if you see this, is let's say you get 180 volts, let's say from this line to ground, and maybe like 80 volts or 70 volts from this line to ground, right? So you've got a much higher voltage on this side than you do on this side, right? So remember how this works. This hot leg is gonna feed an entire leg of your RV, and then this hot leg is gonna feed the other leg of your rig if you have a 50 amp connection. So you've got two separate legs in your distribution system here, and they could be at significantly different voltages. Now, what that's going to do, right, is that's going to cause problems if this side is really low and this side's really high. It's going to cause problems for both sides because the components all around your RV, they're not designed to work at 180 volts. They're not designed to work at 80 volts or at 70 volts. They're designed to work at 120 volts. So if you see this happen when you're doing your checks, that's not something that you want to connect to. And the first thing you should do is contact the campground and have them come take a look at it again. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the theory behind this or how it really works, but what I will say is something that you can tell the campground is, hey, we're seeing unequal voltages between the two lines, and that's an indication that there's a break in the neutral somewhere in the campground. So again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of that. We're not going to go through any schematic diagrams to show it, but I'll tell you what, I will put a link into a web page that I found that explains it pretty well. So if you want to take a look at that later so you have a better understanding, I'll put that link down in the comments. All right, the fourth condition that we're going to cover here is, let's say you get shore power all hooked up, you're in a 50 amp rig like this, and you come in, you turn the air conditioning on because it's the middle of the summer. You just got shore power hooked up. You want to knock that temperature down here, knock that humidity down. So you turn your air conditioning units on. One of them comes on, but then another one doesn't. So you know you got some power, but not quite all the power you need. So if that's the case, probably what's going on there is you're missing one leg of your 50 amp service coming in. Remember, one leg here, and we got one leg coming in here. So if that happens, the most likely case is that you've got some break in the connection in that line from the breaker to the outlet. And I'll tell you, in my experience, the most common problem usually ends up being that this breaker is faulty and it's only sending power through one side of the breaker and not the other. So those are the four biggest issues that I've seen while living in my RV and also, you know, doing this work camping business is, you know, a faulty breaker, the breaker that won't stay tripped for some reason, a low voltage condition, an unbalanced voltage condition, or, you know, a missing hot leg where that means that, you know, only, you know, half of your rig is getting power. So you might be asking yourself again, why does this guy really have this pedestal in his kitchen? Well, I wanted to show you something on here, and I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get the audio for it outside. So I just decided to bring it in. The lighting's okay in here today. But what I wanted to show you is, you know, we talked about doing inspections on your pedestal when you pull in. Well, this one's a pretty good example of a pedestal that has some issues. So, you know, the first thing we did last week is we just kind of moved everything around here, you know, and there wasn't a lot of movement on anything. It felt pretty solid, right? And then one of the checks that we're going to do is just a dry operation of the breakers again. I know this is kind of a review, but I'll get to my point here in a second. So this 50 amp breaker here, it seems to be okay. It's a little spongy when I close it. It doesn't click real good into position, but you know, I probably wouldn't be worried about using this breaker right here. Now let's move to the 20 amp breaker here. This one's a little bit different. And even though I'm just looking at a 20 amp breaker, it applies to either a 30 amp or the 50 amp breakers because they're really all pretty much the same. So if we listen when I shut this 20 amp breaker here, there should only be one distinct click when you shut these breakers. And that will let you know that that breaker shut and it stayed shut. This one tends to give you two distinct clicks, which means what's really happening is that breaker is shutting and then for some reason it's opening again. So let's just take a look at this and see if we can get the audio. Right? So it actually didn't even give a very good first click to tell me that it was shut. And then it gives a second distinct click when I let it down that tells me that that breaker didn't stay shut. And the reason I wanted to point this out, the whole reason I brought this in here was because if you look at it, it looks like the breaker is still shut. It looks like it should be working. So to the untrained person, right, you might think, well, I have the breaker, it's working fine, but I'm not getting power. So now there's something, you know, there must be something wrong with my rig. That's not the case. So what that's called when it's doing that, these breakers have an off position, they have an on position, and then they have what's kind of called a trip-free position where it looks like it's shut, but the breaker is actually tripped. So I want you guys to keep that in mind. This is a big common problem that I see on campground pedestals is the breaker just isn't staying shut. All right, so that's why I've got that in here. I wanted you guys to be able to see that. Again, the other breaker, the 50 amp breaker was okay. I don't think it'd be have too much of an issue here. The 30 amp breaker actually works pretty well. It was. Well, now you can see on the 30 amp breaker, the 30 amp breaker is actually doing the same thing that the 20 amp breaker was doing. So I don't know if I would use that one either. Boy, I had this all rehearsed, and then it decided to go a different direction on me. So, yeah, now this one won't even stay shut. So, as you can see, these things can have all kinds of problems, and they may give you some misleading indications. So, the thing that I always go back to is if you have a problem when you pull in with the electrical at all, getting it hooked up, getting this thing to work right. If you're getting some funky codes on your surge protector, which we're about to talk about in a second, always contact the campground first. Do not call an RV technician to come fix it, because more than likely it's going to be on the campground side. All right, so now let's talk about surge protectors a little bit. So they make all kinds of surge protectors out there for your RV. Some of them are going to be more complex than others, but the bottom line here is that you should have a surge protector protecting your RV at all times whenever it's plugged in, right? So they make 50 amp surge protectors out there, all kinds of different varieties. They make 30 amp surge protectors for you guys with the 30 amp RVs out there, and they can be as complex or simple as you want them to be. So for example, I use the Watchdog 50 amp surge protector. It's Bluetooth enabled, so I can actually get on my phone and take a look and see how much power am I drawing from that pedestal. What's the voltage on the pedestal? How much current am I drawing from that pedestal? And then the great thing about it is, well, there's two really good things about these Watchdogs. If something happens to the pedestal and the surge protector trips to protect your RV, it will shoot a code to your phone and it'll say, hey, we got a trip on your surge protector here. This is the code, and then this is what it means, right? The second thing is if this surge protector takes a big hit, let's say the campground takes a direct hit from the lightning, and it fries itself, it's designed so that you can actually open that surge protector up, take that main board out of the surge protector, and then just order a new one from the company, and it's much cheaper, much cheaper than buying a whole new surge protector. So again, it doesn't matter what kind of surge protector you get. You want one that's Bluetooth enabled, you want one that you hook up to the pedestal, you want one that you can hardwire into your RV itself. It doesn't matter what kind you get, just make sure you get one, because it can be used in a lot of different ways. One, it's going to keep your RV protected from surges, but here's what I really wanted to talk about with these surge protectors is especially some of the more high-end ones. So remember in the last episode, we were doing all the checks here, doing our voltage checks and everything, and that's a really good thing to do, and I recommend you do it every single time. But I also would recommend that you get one of these surge protectors, because when you plug a surge protector into here and then you shut the breaker for that outlet, that surge protector is actually going to analyze that circuit, and it's going to tell you if something's wrong with either one of these circuits or any of these circuits here. So if you're connected here with your surge protector, it'll tell you if there's anything wrong with that 50 amp circuit. Same with the 30 amp circuit as well. It'll tell you that there's something wrong with it. And then guess what? It won't even allow power through that surge protector to your rig. It'll stop it at the surge protector so that you don't damage your rig. So again, that was the big purpose of wanting to talk about the surge protectors, is because it can tell you exactly what's wrong with that campground pedestal if you're having issues. Now again, don't use that as the sole means of checking the campground pedestal. We all know that electronic devices fail. Those surge protectors can fail just like anything else. So it's always a good idea to first check everything here with a meter, and then once you're satisfied that everything looks good, then you plug your surge protector in, you let it do its thing, and if it doesn't pop any codes, then you can plug shore power in and power up your rig. All right, guys, so that pretty much covers it for all of the troubleshooting that I wanted to talk to you about associated with the campground pedestal and the distribution system here. So maybe in a future video, we might cover some troubleshooting inside the rig, but most of the problems I think you're going to run into are going to be associated with the pedestal, and that's why I wanted to get that one out there now. So the last thing I wanted to bring up on this video, like I said before, is I wanted to talk about the adapters. So like I said, you may have a 50 amp rig and you're trying to get into a campground that doesn't have any 50 amp spots available. Now, that's fine, because they make, like I said before, they make these adapters here that you can use to go from, say, 50 amp down to 30 amp or 30 amp to 50 amp, whatever it is that you need, you can buy these adapters to do that. Now, the one thing I want to point out is if you have a 30 amp rig and you need to plug into a 50 amp outlet, they have those adapters and they will work, but just keep in mind that you don't have 50 amps of power just because you're plugged into the 50 amp outlet. If you have a 30 amp rig, that's all you have. Doesn't matter how you plug it in or what adapter you use, you only have 30 amps of power. Okay, so again, I'm not going to get into the details about how these things work, not too much anyway, but I am going to go over this one specifically. This is one that's going to be allow me with a 50 amp rig to plug into a 30 amp outlet if I need to. So let's say, just for example, I pull in late at night, it's pouring down rain outside, worst case scenario, right? I get up here, I plug my rig in, shut this 50 amp breaker, and it doesn't stay shut. Okay, well now I have a problem, right? Well, rather than trying to start all this troubleshooting and everything right now, when it's pouring down rain and it's dark, what I can do is, well, let's try the 30 amp, right? So I have this 30 amp plug. You can see it's got the female 50 amp connections on it, and on the back side is the 30 amp connections. So I can plug this thing straight in, just like this, to the 30 amp outlet, right? Then I can plug my shore power cable into here, and now I have at least some power coming to my rig. Now, again, you got to realize I'm limited to 30 amps, right? But at least I have some power. And the good thing about these adapters is, and this one's the same way, right? You can see they're both 30 to 50. The good thing about these is it's actually tied together internally so that the one hot leg coming from the 30 amps is actually coming out both of the hot legs on this adapter, and it's feeding both sides of my 50 amp RV. So just because I'm plugged into a 30 amp RV doesn't mean I only have one leg of power. If I use one of these adapters here, I can get both legs of my RV up and running, right? Albeit at a lower amperage, but at least I have something, again, in that worst case scenario where you pull in, pouring down rain, and the 50 amp doesn't work, you can sort it out later. All right, guys, so that's really all I wanted to cover for this week. Or for this episode. We talked a little bit about the different problems that you could have with the pedestal, right? You could have a breaker that doesn't work, won't stay, it won't stay shut for some reason. You can come across a low voltage condition, an unbalanced voltage condition, or a ground fault condition, right? So then we talked about what the symptoms of those are going to look like. And then we talked a little bit about troubleshooting just at a very high level to determine whether or not some of those issues are present. And then again, I can't say this enough, if you do have any of these issues, don't assume it's on your RV. Don't assume that the problem is yours. 99% of the time that problem's going to be with the campground, and so the first thing you should do is call them to come take a look at it. And then if for some reason you do end up calling a RV technician, and they come out, they analyze the problem and say, hey, it's a problem with the campground, well, that RV technician is going to want his money. You're going to have to pay him. But my point here is don't expect the campground to reimburse you for that RV technician, because the first thing that should ever happen when you have a problem is to call the campground so that they can come take a look at it. All right, guys, so that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. The purpose here is to make you feel a little bit more at ease when you come across some of these issues. So I hope you got something out of this. If you did, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. That's really important to us, so that we know you guys are getting something out of our content. We know that you enjoy it, and it lets us know that we need to keep doing this kind of stuff. And then we'll see you on the next episode.